Hello, welcome to the channel and thanks for watching. In this video, I'm going to take you through my second necromunda scenery tile. I'm doing kind of an underhive loading dock kind of scheme. First tile I did last week, which is the repair shop for all the machinery that these guys are going to be using. And this second tile is actually the kind of the loading bay, where my concept is the stuff is being brought into this zone of the hive and it's then being lowered into the lower domes and that kind of thing here. So you can see we've got some of the stock and goods that's being brought in. We've done a loading crane arm, and the sort of hash marked bit in the centre is where the stock's going to be lowered through. So first thing I've done is built a tile. Now this is using the zone mortalis tiles that I cast up in resin in a previous video, and you see there I've left a section in the middle with none of the tiles on. That's where the loading dock's going to be, you've seen. So using two kits in this, we're using the galvanic servo haulers from Games Workshop, and we're also going to be using some parts from the Underhive market kit. So first thing, building the servo haulers. Now, it's a really cool mechanical lifting arm you've just seen we built there, and this is actually a relatively good value kit from Workshop. So the actual loading arm is very good value. Now I was going to do a loading arm and scratch build it and whatever, and I looked into doing that, and actually this is just the quickest and cheapest way of doing it. Lovely little piece of kit. And actually Workshop do some very good value scenery pieces. So let's talk about the concept of what I'm doing. I mentioned it briefly there, but what I want to do is like an armoured train, which I've already bought and shown on the channel, moving stock and goods and fuel and whatever into an area of the underhive. And this is going to be a fairly affluent area of the underhive where these things are being brought in, dispatched, dismantled, whatever, and then spread across the hive into higher areas of the dome, or the same dome, and lower. So this section of the build we're doing is just showing this one area that they're going to be lowering into a lower dome, and as the build goes on I'm going to expand on this. The first part of this series I'm just going to be doing the first kind of 2x2 section, then I'll go off and do something else and come back to it. And instead of this 2x2 is being built really so I can play in my gaming room while it's winter and freezing cold in the garage. So there we go, excuses. Also relevant is the first shot you saw, the scenery is still quite shiny because I've not matte varnished it yet. Something I always do, I will spray a matte varnish onto the scenery to kind of dull it down a little bit. It's a little bit too cold for doing that, because if you spray varnishing, it's kind of whether it can go a bit dusty and whatever, so I've left that off. So just in case there's a bit of shine on some of the models when it's finished, that's kind of why. So building this servo hauler kind of crane arm, just as sort of standard, nothing really unusual in how I'm doing this build. Well, this part of it at least anyway, because it's a beautiful piece of kit. And sometimes, you know what, you don't have to scratch build, you don't have to convert. Doing kits as they're intended is absolutely fine, because sometimes they're beautiful kits and you don't want to mess. So these are all being put together quite nicely, and then we'll move on with the rest of this build. Because as much as I've said, you know, sometimes you don't have to convert kits, sometimes you do, and I'm sure the exciting thing of this build is not the watching me build a crane, it's cracking on with the rest of the conversion. I suppose, how do I get my ideas when I'm doing this? This board changed 3 or 4 times as I was actually putting it together, where I was putting pieces. And that's something to bear in mind as well, that, you know, have a plan of what you want to achieve when you're doing a scenery set, but bear in mind you're going to be flexible and, you know, alter it as you go. So put it together as normal, and then I built the little kind of frame that in this actual kit, this is meant to move an armoured container. So you're meant to glue one of the Munitorum armoured containers on top, but I've decided that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to turn this into like a loading trolley for the stuff to be moved off the train, which will be on a later board, and onto here. So digging out some plastic card. This is kind of like hash marked plastic card, and just cutting it to size to make the kind of load bed for this little container. Now, if you don't have a local hobby shop to get plastic card, I've been asked a couple of times because people have said, oh, I can't get it in my area. I will link some links to some plastic card providers in the links down below. It's the same stuff I've used. It's like a Slater's plastic card. It's for model railway and that kind of thing. But I'll link some below. It's slightly more expensive off Amazon than if you do find a proper model shop near you that stocks it. So do have a look around, but if you haven't got one near you, do that. And it's a really useful bit of equipment to have sort of on your bench, plastic card, because you can do all sorts of stuff with it. Available in all kind of sorts of, you know, patterns and techniques and stuff, so definitely worth, you know, having some around just to play with this. So really I'm just gluing this onto this loading bed, pushing it down so that it kind of seals in, and taking, you know, a very simple conversion, this just one little piece of plastic card, and it's going to give a totally different tone to that model. So you see here I've built up the little load bed, and I've built some of the boxes and the barrels from that kit. I've not shown it because, you know, who wants to watch that? So this is kind of the bulk of it kind of done. Now we're looking at the area where this stuff is going to be lowered into the lower area of the underhive. Now, when I built my little zone mortalis tiles, I built them 6x6, and I built little corners left off. without the tiles on, and this was kind of specifically why, so that I could then build in areas where I would put something else other than just the floor tiles. So I've put the 4 tiles on, identical tiles with the corner missing, all into the centre. So now I'm building the panel that's going to go over it. This is using completely blank plastic card as kind of a base layer. I've measured around that square so it's slightly larger. I'm just going to cut that out, and then what I've also done is done a slightly smaller section of, again, plain plastic card. I didn't want any texture on this, and this is going to be the loading dock. The bottom piece just to give a nice border. The top piece we're now going to work on and cut it into 2 to make the loading doors. Now all I'm doing is finding the midpoint of these 2 doors, scoring a line right across the middle so that we know where the midpoint is, and then drawing on the fancy kind of toothed shape that we want to use to make it look like these doors open. So you can kind of see how we've drawn it on. I hope it's not really coming out too well on the camera. So I draw a centre line right across the middle, do another line next to it, and then kind of made that cog tooth in the very centre of the panel. Hope it'll make sense when it pops open, but no real super plan. I could have done, you could do an even more cog tooth design, but I wanted to keep it fairly simple. Obviously what you could do, and I did consider this for this build, was to actually have the door kind of propped open and then the wood cut out a section underneath the wood to make it looking like it lowers into the lower dome, and it's something I might consider later. I've got something in my mind to make it look like you can see into the lower dome, but I just wanted this one to be flat down to give a little bit more gaming space, because some of the other tiles I'm going to do are going to be quite full of scenery. Now what I'm doing here is just shaving off a tiny amount from both sides of the doors, because when I glue this back down I want it to look like there's a gap. As you can see, it's what I'm doing is shaving off a very small amount just on either side of the plastic, just to give us that effect when we put it down. Now, hash markings, obviously absolutely vital in Necromunda. Now, I've not just painted them on by eye, so what I'm doing here is just literally drawing a line and scoring it onto the plastic, scoring the other side of the metal ruler that I'm using, and then the rest of the markings I literally just move across from the line that I've scored, using the width of the metal ruler as the width of the score line. So fairly simple. And a lot easier than drawing it on by eye at the end. And you can see there, hopefully the camera picks it up properly, the lines that we've now scored across both sides of these doors, so that it blends into one when it's shut. Now what I'm doing now is you're going around and putting a couple little nicks and chips to not make the steel look precisely smooth, because it's the underhive. We want to put a little bit of damage on. Now I'm not going overboard with damaging this board and this build. As I said before, I want this to look like a fairly affluent part of the underhive, or this is actually just above the underhive, perhaps in Hive City itself. So I don't want everything looking completely trashed and destroyed. I want this to look like a fairly affluent part of the hive, because again, what I'm planning on doing with some of my gangs later on, I don't want them to be proper underhive sump dwellers. Now I am going to do some proper underhive scenery where everything looks trashed and destroyed, but that's going to come in some later builds, and we'll link in a kind of slightly different way. So, you know, a little bit of damage, a little bit of things, but nothing too extreme. What I'm doing now is using plastic glue to glue down the doorway onto this panel, and then we'll get this stuck down onto the actual board. So a fairly simple way of doing a loading door, but one that's quite effective, hopefully you'll agree. Doesn't cost a lot once you've got a little plastic card in hand, and really adds something slightly different to a board, because I've never personally seen anyone do like the concept of representing the fact that domes are underneath, and actually this is a multi-layered kind of city, and I'm sure in some way they would obviously move things between the different domes and between the different levels. And what you saw me doing there is slicing off the kind of rivets that I put onto the board. I said before in a previous video, the panels, my idea is these are bolted on when the hive's constructed. Now I've taken those bolts off to stick this down, but I took them off very carefully, because one of these panels you'll see just to the right of my hand there has got one of the rivets that didn't mould very well when I cast the original pieces, so I've just stuck that down and replaced the slightly damaged rivet. Okay, so now we're using my favourite hobby material, blue stuff. Previous video I showed you how I used one of the castings of this fan piece, which is taken from a Octarius terrain kit for Kill Team. So I cast up the kind of fan area and a part of that Octarius scenery. Again, there's another video on that. And I'm now just using that cast up to make some panels to go on the floor. So as I said, some of these tiles have got floor panels missing, so I'm just using that to put a fan onto the floor tile, and then using a piece there from a previous build that was a section of a armoured container, and using that for the other panel that's stuck down. And you can see I've stuck the fan piece down there, and that just gives a bit of interest to the flooring, so you've not just got a completely flat floor. Now we're on to another one of the brilliant kits that Workshop have released recently, the Underhive Market. So I've just built one of the awnings for the Underhive Market, and this is going to be like the control panel or control area where the crane is worked from. Digging out the plastic card again, and I'm making just a little rectangle for this little market kit that I've built to stand on. Now we could have the control panel at floor level, but I want it raised, so I've cut out a bit of plastic card and I've cut out a bit of the ridged plastic card with some detail on, so a flat piece and then a ridged piece. I want it quite thick, so I've just used 2 layers of plastic card, because plastic card, depending on the thickness you buy, can be quite flexible. So this is kind of the control zone. Now we could stick it flat to the floor, but I want it raised. The idea being that the person that's climbed up into this little gantry is going to use the control panel, control the crane, and they need a good bit of visibility to know where that crane arm and that kind of mechanical piece is going. So we're going to raise it off the ground. Used in a previous video, the last video, these little plastic RSJs, again, got these from a normal model shop. I think it was a model railway store or something, I think. And I'm just cutting these to size to be kind of the frame that's going to hold the control centre that we're doing. So just cutting them down, not doing a full square round the metal, or the metal area. Just want it to be representational of what we're doing. And I've gauged the height of this piece partly by eye, so does it look good, partly by the fact can I fit a model underneath it but make it look a little bit sort of semi-cramped, and thirdly by the fact I've got a little ladder from a TT Combat wooden kit that I want to make sure is broadly the right height. So several thoughts about that. Now if I wanted it higher I'd just used a different ladder, but it all worked together quite nicely that this ladder was sort of the right height. So I've built this up, I've let it thoroughly dry. You can see the kind of structure that I've created there. Let it thoroughly dry, and I'm just super gluing it down now. Now you could paint it and then glue it down, but I wanted to make sure it was, you know, solidly on the structure, because I think sometimes when you glue things on after you've painted it, the bond is not quite as strong, I don't feel anyway. So I wanted this one glued down at this point. You glue down after if you want to do something similar. Now the ladder, as it comes, this is obviously meant to slot into a TT Combat wooden kit that again I've done on the channel before, my own Mortalis build, so check that out if you've not seen that, another necromunda build that I've done. I'm just going to trim the tabs off the side because we don't need that to clip it in, and then just mucky up this ladder. So take some little chunks out, cut the rungs down a little bit so they don't look quite so pristine and it looks like it's been used, and then I've glued it on the right hand side, which I'm going to go left originally. For some reason I changed my mind and stuck it on the right. I don't think it particularly matters. Now this little piece is from the conservators little kind of tractor that they have. So I've used one tractor in the previous build as kind of in the repair shop that I've done. I'm not going to use the second tractor on this build, so I've just taken that control panel off this tractor, which, you know, I might regret later if I want to do it. I'm filling the gap in the back just with a bit of green stuff and sculpting it so it looks a little bit more not realistic, because nothing's realistic. This is 40k and necromunda after all, but just so it looks a little bit more in keeping. And then we're going to glue that into the little hut that we've just built, and that's the control panel to control this arm. So while we've still got a lot of green stuff wet, I just want to blend in the piece we've made on the floor, so the sort of air vent thing. So I'm just making some little sausages of green stuff and making a sort of very smooth flat cable to blend this in, because when I made the casting of the top of the Zone Octaria set, the cables kind of went off and ran all over the set. Now they're not there in this, so I'm just making a couple of little cables. I've said before, whenever I do green stuff, whatever it is I'm using it for, I always try and make more use of it than just doing one little piece, because otherwise you waste lots of green stuff and whatever. So, you know, with some of this other green stuff, I then banged some of it into a mould that I've made and made sure full use of it. So that was some final detailing, just taking some PVA glue and gluing some sand down in various areas. Now I've left some of the scenery on. You'll see where I've left it is not where it actually ends up in certain cases, but what I don't want to do is slather the board with stuff that's going to get covered. So a little bit of sand down. And now we've sprayed everything black and then sprayed it with lead belcher spray. Now I haven't sprayed it where it is, these have been sprayed separately off the piece because we're going to glue them down somewhere different. And I did, as you see through here, keep playing with where these pieces live on the board, and that's important as you go and don't try and have too many fixed mines. So now the paint scheme, I'm not going to go through fully the paint scheme, I'm just going to touch on it, how I've painted it, just general themes. You can see as I'm painting, said it before for Necromunda, the beauty of it is you don't have to be too precise. So I've painted the crates just with an army green, but I've left bits of the metal showing through because we want them to look battered and damaged, etc. So it's a wonderful thing about painting Necromunda. You don't have to be too precise. Now I like a dirty, battered, damaged paint scheme, not super damaged in this case, because as I said, you know, we're not wanting it to be really, really dirty underhive. I wanted to be slightly more affluent area. So now doing the stripes again, fairly clean paint job here. We're going to mucky it up again later, but just get it so it's looking nice. Don't worry if you make mistakes or leave silver showing through. In fact, you kind of want to leave some silver showing through, like I've said. I'm painting up some of the detail pieces. Now, I'm using the barrels in red, because I've done that on every barrel I've ever painted for 40k, I think, just fuel barrels. And that's something I've tried to do when I'm building the scenery, tie it into other scenery that I've already built so that we can use it sort of cross-functional, if that's even a word. So another big crane, a lovely piece of kit. This again, going for a similar colour scheme to tie it into my first board build. Using an orange colour because I've got the idea that there must be a guild in Necromunda that does all the transport and machinery, not the Mechanicus, because obviously I know they're on Necromunda, but I want to feel like there's a guild of artisans and transport workers, and orange is going to be their colour for me, and it's going to really tie all these guys into the board. Again, I put some sand on, just painting that up. I am going to go back with these boards when I've done the whole tile and do some more detailing and some more dirtying up the floor, because I've got a couple of ideas of how I'm going to do that, and I'm saving a few pieces kind of for later. So as I said, I'm not going to show you the full paint scheme, just touch on this again, and this is a nice Vallejo sepia dirty wash. If you watched the previous vid, this is basically repeating myself here, so I don't want to go through it too much, but the same wash I've used on all the scenery. I've used a very similar wash on all the models to really dirty it down, try and tie them together. Now, you could go to the nth degree when painting your scenery for Necromunda, and you could do each little scenery piece really vibrant and bright, but I want it gritty. It's a backdrop. So before on videos, it's really important actually. Necromunda is almost the hidden player, is the scenery. You've got to put enough effort in to make it look good, because you're not covering the board in tons of models, but you don't, for me, don't want to go massively overboard and super vibrant, because then it takes away. So it's a fine balance to walk, I think, between making the scenery exciting enough but not that it takes away from the game, it adds to it. So, you know, put a lot of effort in, but don't be too worried about bringing every single thing up. You know, I'm not doing any edge highlighting here on the boards, I'm not doing anything like that. You can see I'm just dry brushing this up and putting the metallic colours on there just to make it look nice but not super vibrant. Now, I'm not showing it on here, but I do a couple of layers of dry brushing onto the silver to bring it up and take away some of the dirtiness, the washes left, not all of it, and then I dry brush over like a bronze colour just to give some different tones into the panel. That is important. You can see here I've put my first panel right next to it so I can make sure that I'm getting the same kind of level of dry brushing onto the board, because I do want it to blend together. I don't want it to look like the boards are totally different and been painted by a totally different person. So that can be quite important. If you know, you keep your scenery in a shed or a garage or whatever, dig it back out while you're doing this. Now, just a point on this kind of loading flatbed, wasn't super happy with how this finished up actually, but I'm going to cover it with some crates and things anyway, so it doesn't matter. But I put that orange across there as a dry brush, and I'm just dry brushing some metal across the top of it. Not super happy with how this load bed comes out, but I am going to put scenery on it, as you can see. So that's kind of the finished paint scheme. You see it is quite reflective and shiny. I've not varnished it yet. Matte varnishing it will dull it down. So now I'm going to glue down the scenery pieces. Now when I'm gluing them down, what I've considered is how much cover am I providing if we're going to play a game on this, or when we play a game on this. You know, is there sufficient places for people to hide behind? So I'm putting a crate on top of another one to give some proper cover. I'm also thinking about spreading the scenery out across the board so that, you know, if we're doing run moves, we can run between the scenery, and we're not going to be too covered, and we're going to have to think carefully about how we move. So this is the two tiles pushed together, gives you an idea of how I've spread it about. Single tile there you can see. Hopefully you like the build. I'm really happy with what I'm doing. I'm happy with the progress. I think the scenery is looking really nice, and there will be some more details done on it later, and I'll be adding some other pieces on there. As I said before, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, typical YouTube channels, like, comment, subscribe. Check down below for the links to some of the stuff I've mentioned, and hopefully I'll see you on another video.